Hello, Internet. Welcome to another Wednesday's Serial. I want to talk some comics. I've been reading a bit off from the weekly stuff, which is good. And I wanted to talk a bit about that. I've been trying a couple different book clubs. I'm not going to stick with one, but I want to talk about that. I also, more importantly, want to hit on something about Sunstone, because I was asked by Ed to talk about that a long time ago, and I've read it, but I was sitting there like, I don't know what I could really say. And so when I was talking about a couple other different books, it kind of gave me something at least. So, yeah, that's the plan. It's going to get a little rambly and weavy, but I'm going to be talking about ideas more than the books themselves say, I guess. But it's more the books led me to the ideas, so I thought it would be worthwhile for your listening. Hopefully, if it's not worthwhile if you're listening, I'm sorry. I mean, I only have the 10 people who watch, so who knows. So, the main thing was I did a book club thing with Trillium. Trillium is a Jeff Lemire OG joint. It's kind of a more schlocky sci-fi story. The idea is there's this lady who is in the future, sci-fi future, with spaceships, and there's a big approaching end of humanity thing, and she's researching this odd flower and area to try to deal with it. It's purposely a little bit vague, and I didn't actually read it as closely as I should for part of it. And also you have this explorer character from kind of just that realm of literature, and he's a bit old school in some things, but he also ends up finding this area with the flowers, and they actually don't even speak the same language, which wasn't easy to discern because you're reading them both as English and they're not doing the carrot. They're speaking in a foreign language shorthand that we're accustomed to with comics. And they didn't do anything separate with the font. Actually, I think that was one thing that got to me, is that I felt that there was some opportunities that they took with the lettering that showed that they were willing to be creative, but then they missed out on what seemingly were opportunities to create other new shorthands for the book, which I think were almost necessary given that they were trying to set up so much language barrier and sharing of ideas and the way things sounded at certain points. And some of that was in the lettering of like the sound effects and whatnot, but not actually in the text lettering itself, which was very much a nitpick, but given the nature of the book, I feel did hold it back and actually made me confused at a couple points. So there was something there. The other big thing, if you've ever read Trillium before, is it's very big about flipping back and forth, and apparently the issues would have you you do the double-sided book thing, so you'd read one way, then you'd have to flip the book over and read for another perspective and whatnot. They couldn't do that in the trade, so they forewent some of it, and talking to people about how it was in the issues made me think, oh, that was actually kind of cool. But the way it worked with the trades was it was just back and forth, and there's one issue where it's entirely the girl in the explorer's setting going through, and then the explorer in the sci-fi setting going through, but you had to flip upside down because they were set like mirror image to each other, and that would play it off with some of the framing, which was cool, but it was also somewhat frustrating to read because you're flipping back and forth. And I felt like if there was more of an expectation and a bit more play with it before and after, it would have felt more part of the book. But because it was really just that in a few moments throughout the story whatsoever, it just felt like work. It's actually one of the points where the trade is demonstrably worse than the issues. So that was an interesting little bit. Though ads in a book like this would be death when you're playing with the layout that closely. That's annoying. Though maybe you can make actual breaks. You know that they're actual breaks of the story, so you could use it to your advantage for a few pages here and there. That's just some of it that we talked about. I did appreciate the art of Lemire in this more than I thought I would. The thing is Lemire, when he's doing faces that aren't like extreme close-ups or full page pictures sort of thing, when he's doing kind of the comic work sort of thing, something about his face is just kind of scrunched up and didn't connect with me. But seeing his layouts and everything, it's really amazing. It's great comic art, but it's just that one thing that kept bugging me throughout and really pulled me out, especially for something that's effectively a love story at the end of the day. Because if you can't connect with the people when they're emoting, I mean, that's just not good in general, but in a love story, it's death. And I think that's the problem, was it's his project, but one skill he needed, one artistic aspect that was needed for this book wasn't being met, and I feel like that just brought the entire book to its knees. So yeah, and that was the thing, is this book kind of builds and plays off the relationship, and they even comment, like, when you break it down, they actually only interact with each other for about an hour, but the book is having them live each other's experiences and be there when they need each other, and that's, you know, that plays the idea of the love story and allows you to bring in action and whatnot, and I think that's really interesting for that, and that's atypical, I think, of how we get love stories in comics. You get it as a backdrop or as a character motivation or a connection for, like, what it's really about. It's like subtext or build or conclusion, but it's not a true, you know, romance through and through. It's a story about the idea of these two characters coming together, but it's not really a romance. So, speaking of romance and whatnot, is what brought me back to Sunstone. Like I said, Ed asked me to talk about this years ago, and I just rewatched his review, and I think he hits on something really important. A lot of books, when they bring in sexuality, can be kind of corny or exploited for drama or just kind of done hokily. More problematic, I think, is there's a lot of comics that when you have I mean, if it's even more sexualized in relation to the paragons of virtue we deal with superheroes and whatnot, any sexualization feels like overt over-sexualization, even if that isn't the case. And those tend to be the characters that run as villains, but they play it as kind of this dalliance with the dark side, and it's demonizing sex, straight up, which is not great. So, having a book being published out there that's straight up kind of a bit of a kink fetish book like Sunstone is great. And I've heard a couple different reviews, and I've heard people talk about it differently. Like, Sunstone isn't like straight porn. It's not, but it is titillating, and it is erotic, and it is a romance, and it does have humor, which is something Ed brought up very well, that they bring in humor with that, which I think is important for romance, because with any of those stories, you need to lock into the characters and care about them quickly. Humor tends to be a great shortcut with it. I'm not saying it has to happen every time, but I think you're going to tend to find the better romance stories tend to have characters that are funnier, just because that gets you to care about their lives, and then that's the only way you can get them to care about the romance, because otherwise you don't have a hook. Because there's not going to be any huge stakes with the romance. It's literally whether or not the relationship works out and the ups and downs of it. And that's the kind of beautiful part, is like the daily lives and whether or not something goes well or not is really big. Whereas, like, with Spider-Man, his date with, you know, bottle glasses girl is going to go poorly, but it's for the sake of the safety of the city, so oh well, right? You don't really, it almost pulls you back from the investment in Peter Parker's emotional health, which some writers have played with to greater effect than others. But I think that's really important to see, and to see that the stakes of the romance are hinged on literally the two characters is the biggest and greatest thing, and it's something that Sunstone pulls off that other comics have failed. And I think that's part of the reason why we don't see too many romance comics out there, is it's a tough trick to pull off, and especially to hook new readers, because if you don't get them caring about your characters in 1 to 2 issues, you're done. That's it. The other important thing to remember is that Sunstone was a DeviantArt comic. And that may not mean a lot to a lot of people, but it does say certain things about the audience where it started. It kind of started off as just kind of a dalliance in him doing something. I mean, I think the expectation was hopefully, a webcomic, maybe decent webcomic status, which is very different from going to print, which is awesome that they're able to pull it off. I think it's also because the artist, and I'm honestly not going to try to pronounce his name. I put it out there to see if anyone knew how, but I can't. He did other work like Witchblade and other stuff for Top Cow, so I think them finding out that, or maybe him bringing up that, he had this other project one that they're like, print it. I think it's seen a lot more success than anyone would have ever guessed, given that it's such a deviation from what normally sells or anything that people would normally look for, which is proof that comics really need to diversify what they put out there. Diversity doesn't always mean, skin color of characters. It can mean content, and I think that's something we've been struggling with. An Image made a big break, and now you can get a horror comic every month or a crime comic every month, and a hard sci-fi comic every month. But beyond that, there's other stuff out there too, and we don't see enough of it, especially in the American market. Bring it back to romance. But so the main character, Lisa Williams, she's subordinate in that it's a BDSM role and BDSM relationships. So they play off that, and they play off some of the misconceptions and whatnot. And having talked to some people that are in or around that community, this comic actually has been one of the best things for them, because people have just read it because it's a decent story, but it also does break down some preconceived notions about that community and people who practice that sort of thing. So, I mean, that is the number one reason to be reading more different stuff, is to learn about the world around you through the lens of fiction so that you can care about it. And hey, more reason to read Sunstone than almost anything else for that if you haven't yet. And I think she's a great character because I think she plays a way that something we don't get to read not only in comics but nearly any story. She's fairly reclusive. She's not very outgoing. That's not to say she doesn't do anything, that she's not willing to take a risk. Her meeting up with Allie, who's Dom and all this, and kind of the character that allows the story to happen a bit more, is a bit more of a character. But Lisa is much more of a normal person, I think, and in a way that we don't get that kind of personality that I think a lot of people could relate to in nearly anything, because it's really hard to write an engaging story with a character that's fairly reclusive and not very outgoing and whatnot. So, again, another amazing trick that this pulls off that very few things do. I mean, digging in, the art is sketchy and kind of fluid. I mean, it's very digitally, but it just feels inky and wet. It's a really interesting style, and it works great for the comic, but it is just this guy's style, and it works. And the other interesting thing is, like, this is the sort of art, especially being Top Cow, I mean, people could say cheesecake, and sure, but not in the way that I've seen any other cheesecake book do. Like, these are real human beings, and yeah, it's objects of sexual desire and eroticism. You're not going to be getting people that aren't a bit idealized, right? But they end up being human. They actually, because it's BDSM and whatnot, they actually talk about and deal with the limits of anatomy, and that comes into the book, which means in order to reflect that, the art style has to, have its basics down and have that character structure that, I think when I say that, it sounds like, yeah, of course, most professional artists would have that down, especially on the comic book level. The truth is you go through the Rolodex of Marvel artists, and maybe not the ones that spring to mind initially, the big names, but a lot of the other guys that get work, that are doing the workman-like stuff that keeps, Marvel and DC afloat because people need to fill books and they have to bring people up. Some of those guys don't always have the best grasp of anatomy, and yeah, the curse of Liefeld and frankly, sometimes Jim Lee comes through, and these characters are doing things that just betray anatomy. And I think, it happens, and you don't want to fault an artist for every little mistake they make. And sometimes it is a panel, and it's just, these things happen. But I mean, not in this book, and I think credit needs to be credit due. The art fits the book. And like Trillium, we have a pet project here. We have someone trying to do this romance from their perspective and adding in the things they want to add in, but the art's fitting the story, and it plays around with it in so many great ways, and that's what really makes it such a great comic. What makes it, how do I say this, not a great print comic at times, is that with this being digital, a lot of the way it was originally presented was just a scroll. So you'd load up an image, and then it would fill up your screen, and you would just scroll down through it. And you'll see, especially in the first trade, I think once he realized he'd be going to print, he adapted for it, was that there are some breaks on the pages that are rough and don't necessarily make the most sense. And that's because it wasn't intended for that. And that's it. I don't think it really takes away from the book in any way, but I think just knowing that there's going to be a couple weird shifts between pages because of the way it was originally done allows you to forgive something that would be perceived as kind of an odd mistake or just kind of odd pacing, when in fact it really wasn't. It's just an adaptation issue, and a slight one at that. And I'm already catching myself. This is why I found it so hard to talk about Sunstone, is that I don't really want to dive into the plot too much or the characters too much, because any reveal of the character turns into a reveal of the plot as these two characters get to know each other. I mean, that's romance again. And the thing is I don't want to spoil anything for anyone. I want to get people to read this book. And maybe giving a little sparks the interest, right? But I think talking around enough to say, the craft's there, the heart's there, the interest is there, and it's something a bit off. And if you look for Sunstone reviews on YouTube like I did, you'll find people who don't normally talk about comics, people who just do a few videos and were inspired enough by this book to talk about it, or they talk about, when I say books, that the things you get at the library sort of books, not the issues whatnot we're accustomed to, talking about this book because there's something there. And I think that says something. It really just hits a level of something special that I think should be celebrated and really should be pushed to the next level, because not only could we use more Sunstone, we could use the mentality that Sunstone is a hit and we need more people to be doing stuff like this. Because I'd like to see that diversity in comics. Frankly, I'd like to be able to pick up a romance I'm into every month. I think that's something that would be good for the palette, good for the variety, and just good all around for everyone. But screw everyone, it'd be good for me. And because this video's gone too long and I'm not going to put any production to it anyways, I'm going to tie that into something else I've been reading. In the Japanese market, as you might heard, way better than the American market. Not necessarily. But there is something to be said for them having variety and being able to push to different tastes. The other thing is that they have a huge doujinshi market, which is basically just fan comics. And the legality is a little different there, and some toes are being stepped on all the time, but people make comics of their favorite characters doing what they want. A lot of times this is just, people telling their stories with the characters, c'est la vie. But more often than not, tends to be porn. Just tends to be porn. Usually softcore, but definitely a lot of hardcore. I found a very awesome take on Bruce and Alfred from The Dark Knight Returns in there. That was a treat. But the reason I bring that up is Sunstone is able to pull that sort of straight sexuality and not be afraid of it in a way that we rarely get to see. And there's definitely underground comics that are porn comics. A lot of them are just fetish and just straight stuff you'd see in Penthouse and whatnot. There's some other stuff from like Chaikin or R. Crumb or Brandon Graham that hit different levels of story to just, boob art or whatever it is. There's a lot to be seen there. But that's all there. The other big thing from Japan that I've been reading, terrible segue, was Dragon Ball. Hold on. Dragon Ball, actually, the first, is a hilariously, fairly child-oriented comic, but Japanese child-oriented. So there's a lot of jokes about, like, panties, and Goku can't recognize if different characters are male or female, so he gives them a pat-pat, as they say. And so it's a lot of, like, juvenile, just little, like, semi-sexual jokes, but the way that, like, a middle schooler would be approaching it. And that's just kind of part and parcel. And there's a lot of moments in there that I was like, oh my god, what am I reading? How is this for kids? But you have to pull back, remember that things are different. Remember that, like, Dragon Ball wasn't, like, this huge thing, especially when it was starting. It was just one of those comics that wasn't meant to go for frickin' ever. But when it got a little bit of popularity, guys gotta eat, kept rolling with it, and then it shifted to Dragon Ball Z, which is very different. It uses the same characters, but it's a different kind of story. Actually, the first time that they get all the Dragon Balls together, which is super early in the story, to save the world from being controlled by this guy who's wishing for world domination, someone busts out and wishes for panties real quick, and that's it. It's a translation issue between a hot girl's panties, basically, or specifically Bulma's panties, which is an interesting, weird bit that I don't understand how one's better than the other for the censors, and I can't remember which is which because it's such a odd moment, but interesting translation issue. So I've been going through some of that. I don't know if I'm going to actually finish Dragon Ball because it's voluminous and I'm not enjoying as much as some of the other stuff I'm meaning to read. But yeah, just a whole bunch of stuff I've been reading. I just kind of wanted to catch up and get it all out in one video. So thanks for watching. Feel free to like, favorite, and subscribe. And please check in when we again talk soon about comics. And feel free to hit me up on Twitter here and talk about comics. If you make a request, I might honor it in half a year, I think it was. Yeah. Alright. Bye.